the world had shrunk to a white hell. In late November 1942, for the nearly 300,000 men of the German Sixth Army, the universe was no longer the thousand-year Reich, but a frozen cauldron of snow, hunger, and death on the banks of the Volga. Operation Uranus, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's brilliant and massive pincer movement, had snapped shut like a jaw of steel, and they were trapped inside. For a young grenadier from Saxony, huddled in a ruined cellar on the outskirts of Stalingrad, each day was a battle for survival before the real fighting began. The cold was a relentless predator, with temperatures plunging to 20 degrees below zero. Rations had been cut to a thin soup of stale bread and, if they were lucky, horse meat. Ammunition was as scarce as hope. Hermann Göring's promise to supply the army by air had become a cruel joke. The few transport planes that made it through the Soviet defenses were like drops of water in a desert. And from his headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer, in a fit of strategic denial, had issued the most fateful order of all. The Sixth Army was to hold out to the last man. Any breakout attempt was forbidden. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, morale was disintegrating. The men stared westward, across the wind-swept steppe, and asked the only question that mattered. Could Germany save them? Was there anyone on the outside who could break the ring of red steel and free them from this frozen tomb? Total annihilation seemed not a possibility, but an impending certainty. Amid the catastrophe looming over the Eastern Front, Adolf Hitler turned to the man he considered his greatest strategic fireman. On November 27th, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the architect of victory in France and the conqueror of the Crimea, was summoned to take command of a conglomerate of shattered units and hastily assembled reserves, given the optimistic name Army Group Dawn. His mission was both simple and nearly impossible: stabilize a collapsing front and rescue the Sixth Army. Manstein was, without doubt, the most brilliant strategist the Wehrmacht possessed. A master of maneuver warfare, the Bewegungskrieg, he saw the battlefield as a fluid chessboard, always seeking the bold move that would unbalance his opponent. Within days, he conceived a characteristically audacious plan. It would be a two-phase operation, a symphony of coordinated force. The first phase, codenamed Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, would be a powerful relief attack from the outside, carried out by an armored spearhead. The second, Operation Donnerschlag, Thunderclap, would be a simultaneous breakout by the Sixth Army from inside the pocket to meet their rescuers. Manstein firmly believed that his tactical genius and the superiority of his panzer divisions could breach the Soviet encirclement. However, the brilliant field marshal operated with a fatal flaw. It was not a flaw in his military intellect, but in his character. Manstein was a product of the Prussian officer corps, a man whose loyalty to the state and its commander-in-chief was absolute. He was incapable of disobeying a direct order from Hitler, even when he knew it was strategically suicidal. He trusted that his brilliance on the field could compensate for the Führer's irrational decisions. It was a professional arrogance that his adversary was about to exploit without mercy. That adversary, Georgy Zhukov, was not celebrating his victory. For him, the success of Operation Uranus was not the end of the game, but merely the first move in a much larger, more lethal combination. While Manstein was planning how to save 300,000 men, Zhukov and the Soviet High Command, Stavka, were already planning how to annihilate 1 million. Their plan was Operation Saturn. It was not a simple attempt to destroy the Stalingrad Kessel. It was a massive, sweeping offensive designed to drive south to the city of Rostov. If Rostov fell, the entire southern wing of the German army, including Army Group A fighting in the Caucasus, would be completely cut off, trapped against the Black Sea. It would be a disaster of a magnitude that would dwarf Stalingrad. Zhukov was not thinking about the current battle. He was thinking about how to win the war. On December 12, 1942, the steppe trembled. Manstein had unleashed his winter storm. Leading the attack was General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, with the LVII Panzer Corps as its spearhead. It was a formidable force, equipped with reliable long-barreled Panzer IVs and, for the first time in combat, a handful of the new and fearsome Tiger Leopard heavy tanks. The assault struck the Soviet lines with tremendous ferocity. Despite valiant resistance, the Red Army units, exhausted by the previous offensive, began to give ground. Day after day, Amid blinding blizzards and paralyzing cold, Hoth's panzers pushed forward, clawing their way through the Soviet defenses. News of the advance hit Stavka and Moscow like a shockwave. The threat was real. Manstein was not bluffing. His armored spearhead had the power and the skill to break the ring of encirclement. Panic began to seep into some corners of the Soviet high command. Voices were raised calling to cancel the planned Operation Saturn and divert all available reserves to stop Hoth's advance. It seemed the logical, safest decision, to reinforce the wall that Manstein was attacking. But Zhukov and his colleague, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, saw the situation differently. In a moment of pure strategic genius, they made a decision that would change the course of the war. They were not going to cancel their offensive. They were going to modify it. They were going to use Manstein's own attack as the anvil upon which they would smash his army. The ambitious plan for Operation Saturn was scaled down and refocused. It became Operation Mali Saturn, Little Saturn. The objective was no longer distant Rostov. The new objective was much closer and far more devastating for Manstein. The main blow would now be aimed at the wildly exposed left flank of Army Group Don, a sector defended by the ill-equipped and demoralized Italian 8th Army. Zhukov's logic was flawless and ruthless. Manstein had concentrated his best troops, his precious panzers, into a single, powerful punch. This meant the rest of his front was fragile. Instead of smashing head-on into the tip of Manstein's spear, Zhukov was going to cut the spear's shaft in half. Instead of reinforcing the wall Manstein was attacking, Zhukov decided to demolish the foundations of Manstein's house. The board was set. Two of history's greatest military minds were about to unleash their masterstrokes. For a week, it seemed that Manstein's genius would prevail. Hoth's panzers advanced relentlessly to the northeast. They crossed the frozen Oksay River in a fierce battle, pushing the Soviet defenders back with every kilometer gained. Inside the Stalingrad Kessel, news of the advance spread like wildfire, rekindling the flame of hope. The starving, freezing soldiers listened for the faint, distant rumble of cannons on the horizon. They spoke in whispers of Uncle Manstein's, their savior, coming to their rescue. On December 19th, hope reached its zenith. The vanguards of the LVII Panzer Corps reached the bank of the Mishkova River. They were only 48 kilometers from the perimeters of the 6th Army. They could see the glow of the city's fires in the night sky. Success seemed within their grasp. Manstein, sensing the crucial moment had arrived, sent an urgent radio message to General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army. He informed him that Hoth had reached the Mishkova and begged him to launch his part of the plan, Operation Thunderclap. Paulus was to attack to the southwest with all the forces he could muster, break the encirclement, and link up with his rescuers. Paulus's reply sealed his army's fate. An obedient, methodical officer to the last, he replied that he could not launch the operation without an explicit direct order from the Führer. He knew his troops, weakened and low on fuel, could barely cover the 48 kilometers. A breakout attempt was an all-or-nothing gamble, and he would not make it without Hitler's approval. That order never came. While Manstein waited in vain for Paulus to act, Zhukov unleashed his own thunder. On December 16th, Operation Little Saturn crashed into the Italian 8th Army. The impact was cataclysmic. The Italians, equipped with antiquated cannons and with no morale to fight in the Russian winter, crumbled almost instantly. A tide of Soviet T-34 tanks surged out of the blizzard, infantry clinging to their hulls, and drove deep into Manstein's rear. They did not stop. They advanced tens of kilometers in a single day, destroying headquarters, supply dumps, and airfields. They created absolute chaos in the rear of Army Group Don. Now, between December 19th and 23, Manstein faced an impossible choice, a strategic nightmare. To his front, his armored spearhead on the Mishkova River was stalled. The Soviets had pulled off their own miracle. General Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army, an elite unit, had conducted a forced march of nearly 200 kilometers through a blizzard, arriving just in time to establish a steel defensive line on the northern bank of the Mishkova. Hoth could advance no further. Meanwhile, in his rear, the front had evaporated. A Soviet flood threatened to cut the communication and supply lines of his entire army group, including Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. The rescue of the 6th Army was no longer the main issue. The survival of his own command was now at stake. The rescuer was about to be trapped himself. The hunter had become the hunted. On December 23rd, with a heavy heart, Manstein made the only decision possible. He sent the order that doomed the Sixth Army. He ordered Hoth to halt his attack towards Stalingrad and pull back. Worse, he had to tear entire panzer divisions away from the rescue effort and send them desperately westward to try and plug the massive gap in his flank. Operation Winter Storm was officially over. Inside the Kessel, the faint rumble of friendly cannons faded away. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any bombardment. The last flame of hope was extinguished, leaving only the cold, dark certainty of annihilation. The news spread through the trenches and cellars. Manstein was retreating. They were alone. The genius of Zhukov's plan was revealed in all its brutality. He had not merely stopped Manstein's rescue attempt, he had used it as bait. He had lured Manstein's elite force forward, forcing him to commit his best units, while preparing a killing blow at his weakest point. The humiliation for Manstein was total. He, the master of maneuver, had been outmaneuvered. He had been forced to react to the Soviet plan, to abandon his own offensive, to run, and put out the fires Zhukov had lit in his rear. He went from being the battle's director to a piece on Zhukov's board, forced to move his forces not to win, but merely to survive. The domino effect was devastating. Hoth's retreat not only sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, but also forced Manstein into a long and costly fighting withdrawal westward for the rest of the winter. He had to fight desperately for the survival of his own army group, sacrificing men and materiel at every step. The strategic initiative on the southern front had irrevocably passed to the Soviets. Zhukov had not just won the battle, he had dictated its terms from start to finish. With the failure of Operation Winter Storm, the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. They endured another month of unspeakable agony. Starvation, disease, and the cold claimed more lives than Soviet bullets. Finally, on February 2, 1943, the remnants of a proud army, reduced to 90,000 skeletal, frostbitten men, surrendered. The Stalingrad disaster was complete. Manstein, in a testament to his considerable tactical skill, did eventually manage to stabilize a new defensive line far to the west, preventing the total collapse of the entire southern front. But it was a Pyrrhic victory achieved at a terrible cost. His army group Don had suffered massive casualties. The Axis satellite armies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian, that had been protecting the German flanks were effectively destroyed as coherent fighting forces, a blow from which the Axis would never recover. The strategic duel between Zhukov and Manstein in the winter of 1942-1943 became a defining moment of the Second World War. It cemented Georgy Zhukov's legacy as the architect of Soviet victory, a marshal who combined an iron will with a profound understanding of the massive scale and brutality of war on the Eastern Front. On the other hand, it exposed the fundamental limitation of purely tactical genius. It proved that the brilliance of a commander like Manstein was useless when faced with the crushing strategic reality imposed by Stavka and, above all, when shackled by the suicidal intransigence of Adolf Hitler. Manstein's humiliation was not merely a defeat on the battlefield, it was the final, conclusive demonstration that the era of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was over for good. The Red Army, under the command of men like Zhukov, had learned, adapted, and was now the one dictating the terms of the war. The victory at Stalingrad was not just the destruction of an army, it was the turning point where power shifted from Berlin to Moscow, beginning the long, bloody road to the final defeat of the Third Reich.